I found out someone was getting married in my ski lodge the same way most people find out a window is broken. Something felt wrong before I even saw it. Snow was falling in slow, lazy sheets across the mountains that morning, the kind of snowfall that makes the whole world feel quiet. My truck rolled up the long private road to Hollis Notch Lodge, and before I reached the parking area, I saw a line of luxury SUVs stretching along the driveway. Fresh tire tracks cut through the snow. Valet signs stood where my family's trail markers used to be. Somebody had turned my property into an event venue. Then I heard the music. By the time I stepped out of the truck, a string quartet was playing inside the lodge my parents built with their own hands nearly 40 years ago. The sound drifted through the cold mountain air while guests in expensive coats laughed and carried champagne glasses across my front deck. Nobody looked confused. Nobody looked nervous. They acted like they belonged there. They didn't. I walked through the front doors and stopped cold. More than 100 people filled the great room. White flowers wrapped around the stone fireplace. Rows of chairs covered the pine floors. A wedding arch stood beneath the massive windows overlooking the valley. At the center of it all stood Tessa Marigold Klein, smiling like she owned the place. She spotted me almost immediately. Her smile never moved. "Sir," she said, holding a tablet against her chest, "you're not supposed to be in here." I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. "Not supposed to be in here?" I asked. "This is my lodge." Several guests turned their heads. The musician stopped playing for half a second before awkwardly continuing. Tessa stepped closer, lowering her voice as if she were explaining something to a child. "This is a private HOA ceremony," she said. "Please leave before you disrupt the event." That was the moment I realized this woman genuinely believed she had authority over property she didn't own. Big mistake. I looked around the room. I saw muddy footprints crossing the hardwood floors my mother spent years protecting. I saw rental decorations hanging from beams my father raised himself. I saw strangers taking photos in front of a family fireplace that held 40 Christmas memories. And somehow, the angrier I should have become, the calmer I felt. That surprised even me. Tessa must have taken my silence as surrender because she turned away and waved to the wedding coordinator. "We're proceeding," she announced. "Everything is under control." Under control. Those words almost made me smile. Because what she didn't know was that I had already spent 3 weeks collecting documents. I had copies of the deed. I had county records. I had security logs. I had evidence that would make this entire ceremony stop faster than a blizzard closing a mountain pass. But I wasn't going to explain any of that yet. Not there. Not then. Instead, I looked at Tessa and said one sentence. "You might want to verify who owns this building before those vows start." For the first time all morning, something flickered across her face. Not fear. Not yet. Just uncertainty. Then she recovered and laughed. The guests laughed too. The music started again. The bride appeared at the top of the staircase. Everyone thought the ceremony was about to begin. They were wrong. Very wrong. And what happened next turned into one of the strangest property disputes I've ever seen in my life. If you've ever watched someone act completely confident while standing on the wrong side of the law, you'll understand exactly why I remember every second of that day. And if you're listening from somewhere with snow, mountains, ranch land, lake property, or even just a backyard you've worked hard to protect, you might recognize a lesson hidden inside this story before it's over. Let me back up for a minute because none of what happened that morning makes sense unless you understand what that place meant to me. Hollis Notch Lodge was never supposed to be a business. It was never supposed to be a wedding venue, a community clubhouse, or one of those luxury mountain destinations you see in glossy magazines. My parents built it in 1984 on 38 acres of steep Colorado timberland after saving for nearly 15 years. My father spent weekends hauling stone up the mountain in an old pickup truck that barely made the climb. My mother designed every room with a yellow legal pad and a pencil she kept tucked behind her ear. They built that lodge one paycheck at a time. That matters. When I was a kid, there was no paved road leading up there. There was no gate. There were no vacation homes scattered across the valley. There was just forest, snow, and a narrow dirt trail that disappeared every winter under 6 feet of powder. Most people thought my parents were crazy for building so far from town. They did it anyway. They loved the mountains. Every Christmas, every birthday, every major family moment happened inside those walls. The stone fireplace in the great room was where my father taught me how to split firewood. The long dining table was where my mother hosted Thanksgiving dinners that somehow squeezed 20 people into a room built for 12. The place carried memories in every corner. Then life happened. I spent most of my adult years working ski patrol across the Rockies. Avalanche control, search and rescue, emergency response, long nights, early mornings, dangerous weather. The kind of work where staying calm matters more than being strong. One winter, about 13 years ago, an avalanche rescue went sideways. Nobody died, thank God, but I took a bad fall that left my right knee full of metal and ended the career I thought I would have forever. Everything changed. During recovery, I moved back to the lodge full-time. I thought I was just healing a knee. Turns out I was healing a lot more than that. The mountains have a way of slowing your mind down. Every morning, I would wake before sunrise, start a fire, pour a cup of coffee, and watch the valley wake up through those giant windows. No traffic, no noise, no deadlines, just silence, real silence. The kind people spend thousands of dollars trying to find on vacation. About 5 years later, my parents passed ownership into a family trust. Nothing complicated, nothing secret. Everything recorded properly with the county. Taxes paid every year. Insurance updated every year. Property lines surveyed and documented. Paperwork matters. Most people do not think about deeds and ownership records until someone challenges them. By then it is usually too late. My father used to tell me, never assume people know where your property ends. Make sure you know. Smart advice. I did not realize how smart until recently. The valley started changing around 2018. Construction crews arrived. Trees came down. New roads appeared. Then came Alpine Crest, a subdivision filled with expensive homes and people looking for mountain views. Most of the new neighbors were perfectly fine. Friendly people. Families. Retirees. Folks looking for a quiet place to live. But communities do not always change because of hundreds of people. Sometimes they change because of one. And the first time I heard the name Tessa Marigold Klein was during a conversation at the general store when a cashier rolled her eyes and said, "That woman seems to think she owns half the mountain already." At the time, I laughed. Looking back, maybe I should have paid closer attention. Tessa moved into Alpine Crest in early spring, right after the last heavy snow melted off the lower roads. At first, she seemed like the kind of neighbor nobody would think twice about. She smiled at everyone, remembered names almost instantly, and somehow managed to be present at every community gathering within her first month. People liked her. That was the problem. She drove a dark gray luxury SUV that always looked freshly washed, even after a mountain storm. She wore expensive clothes without making them look flashy, and she had a way of speaking that made ordinary suggestions sound like expert advice. Every conversation felt carefully planned. Within 6 months, she was running most of the social events inside Alpine Crest. Not officially at first, just practically. If there was a holiday dinner, she organized it. If there was a charity fundraiser, she coordinated it. If there was a neighborhood meeting, somehow she always ended up standing at the front of the room, holding a microphone. People listened. Then the language started changing. That was the first thing I noticed. The old residents called things what they were. Roads were roads. Lots were lots. Property lines were property lines. Tessa preferred different words. Shared spaces. Community assets. Regional amenities. Collective access opportunities. Everything sounded bigger and more important when she said it. That was not an accident. One afternoon, I stopped by the local coffee shop in town and overheard her talking with 3 newer homeowners. She had a tablet open on the table and was pointing at pictures of the valley. One of those pictures showed my lodge sitting on the ridge above Alpine Crest. I knew that photo. It came from a marketing brochure the developer had used years ago when they were first selling lots. The lodge was visible in the background because it overlooked the valley. It was never part of the subdivision. Not once. Not ever. Yet there she was tapping the image with her finger. The mountain lifestyle is what everyone bought into, she was saying. The community should have reasonable access to the area's historic features. Historic features. I nearly laughed into my coffee. My family home had suddenly become a feature. A week later, she introduced herself properly. I was stacking firewood beside the lodge when her SUV rolled up the driveway. She stepped out carrying a leather folder and a smile that looked professionally practiced. "Grant," she said, extending a hand. "I have been hoping we could talk." I shook her hand. "About what?" Her eyes drifted toward the lodge. "About opportunities. That word again. She explained that Alpine Crest was growing quickly. More families were moving in. More events were being planned. More visitors were coming through the valley. She believed the lodge could play a valuable role in bringing the community together. I listened quietly. Then I said, "The lodge is private property." Her smile stayed exactly the same. Of course, I understand that. But she did not. Over the next few months, she kept finding reasons to bring it up. Sometimes it was a holiday gathering. Sometimes it was a charity auction. Sometimes it was a community leadership retreat. Every suggestion ended with the same answer. No. I was polite every time. She was polite every time. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual. Underneath, something felt off. One evening, she stopped me after a neighborhood meeting and looked up toward the ridge where the lodge lights glowed against the snow. "You know," she said casually, "a lot of people believe places like that should belong to the community." I shrugged. Good thing beliefs and ownership are not the same thing. For the first time, her smile slipped. Only for a second. Then it came back. "Ownership can be more complicated than people realize," she said. I remember watching her walk away across the parking lot that night. The cold air smelled like pine and wood smoke. The mountains were completely still. And for reasons I could not explain yet, I had a feeling that conversation was going to matter later. The first real sign that something had changed came on a Thursday morning in late September. The aspens were turning gold across the valley. The air smelled like pine needles and cold stone, and I was repairing a section of railing on the lodge deck before winter arrived. Around 10 o'clock, I heard vehicles climbing the driveway. Not one vehicle. 3. I looked up and saw a florist van, a catering truck, and a pickup loaded with folding tables making their way toward the lodge. At first I assumed they had the wrong address. That happens sometimes in mountain communities. Delivery drivers get lost. Contractors read maps wrong. People turn into the wrong driveway. Then they parked. Then they started unloading. That got my attention. I walked down from the deck and met a young man carrying flower arrangements toward my front entrance. "Morning," I said. "Can I help you?" He smiled. "We are setting up for the site inspection." I blinked. "What site inspection?" He looked confused. "The wedding." "Wedding?" For a second I thought maybe he was joking. Then another worker carried a stack of event brochures past us. The front page showed a photo of my lodge. My lodge. Underneath was a logo that read Alpine Crest's signature mountain events. Something cold settled in my stomach. I asked where they got authorization to be there. The young man immediately pointed toward a black SUV parked near the driveway. Tessa stepped out carrying her tablet. She looked completely relaxed. "Good morning, Grant," she said. "Beautiful day, is it not?" I ignored the weather. "Why are these people on my property?" Her expression never changed. She tapped a few buttons on the tablet and turned the screen toward me. There was a document displayed with Alpine Crest branding across the top. The title read Event Authorization Agreement. "Everything has been approved," she said. "This is simply a preliminary walkthrough." I read the first page. Then I read it again. The document claimed Alpine Crest had venue access rights for approved community functions. That was news to me. "This is nonsense," I said. "The lodge is not part of Alpine Crest." Tessa folded her arms. "That is your interpretation." My interpretation. Those words almost made me laugh. Property ownership is not an interpretation. It is either yours or it is not. I told the vendors to stop unloading equipment. Most of them looked uncomfortable. None of them seemed interested in arguing. They were just doing their jobs. Tessa, however, looked perfectly confident. "Grant," she said, lowering her voice, "you are creating unnecessary conflict." "No," I replied. "I am protecting my property." The conversation might have ended there if she had walked away. Instead, she pulled out her phone. 5 minutes later, a deputy arrived. That surprised me. What surprised me even more was that she had called first. Deputy Aaron Keller stepped out of his patrol vehicle, looking like a man who already regretted being involved. I had known Aaron for years. He was a good guy. He listened to both sides. He looked at the document. He listened to me. Then he sighed. "Grant, until ownership and access rights are verified, I need everyone to keep things calm." Tessa immediately jumped in. "Thank you, Deputy. We appreciate your professionalism." She said it loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Then she did something that told me exactly what kind of game she was playing. She started recording video. She pointed her camera toward me and said, "Unfortunately, some people struggle with community progress." Community progress. Standing on my private property. while filming me. The vendors shifted awkwardly. Aaron looked annoyed. I looked at Tessa. She expected me to lose my temper. She wanted a scene. She wanted a clip she could share later. She did not get one. I simply stepped aside and said, "You should make sure every piece of paperwork you are relying on is real." For the first time, she narrowed her eyes. Only slightly. Then she smiled again. The vendors finished their walkthrough. The deputy left. The vehicles eventually drove away. On the surface, it looked like she had won. That was exactly what she wanted everyone to think. What she did not realize was that the moment she showed me that document, she handed me the first piece of evidence I would eventually need. What happened after that should have made the whole thing fall apart. It did not. It got bigger. Over the next 3 weeks, I started noticing things that did not make sense. New vehicles kept showing up near the lodge while I was away in town. People I had never met were taking photographs from the road. One afternoon, I found a couple standing near the overlook behind the property, studying a printed brochure. When I asked if they needed help, the husband smiled and said, "We are thinking about booking our daughter's wedding here next summer." That stopped me cold. "Booking it through who?" I asked. "Alpine Crest Events," he replied. The woman running it said this is one of the most exclusive venues in Colorado. Exclusive venue. Those 2 words told me everything I needed to know. Tessa was no longer talking about community gatherings. She was selling access. A few days later, I stopped by the Alpine Crest Clubhouse for a public board meeting. The room was packed. Homeowners filled nearly every chair, and Tessa stood near the front beside a projector screen displaying a presentation called Community Revenue Opportunities. That sounded innocent enough. It was not. She clicked through slides showing projected income from seasonal events, mountain retreats, holiday festivals, and destination weddings. The numbers were surprisingly large. People paid attention. Then she showed a photograph of my lodge. Nobody asked permission. Nobody mentioned ownership. Several residents nodded approvingly, as if everything had already been settled. "These partnerships will strengthen reserves and reduce future dues," Tessa explained. A few people even applauded. That bothered me more than I expected. Not because they supported her. Most of them simply did not know the truth. They believed what they were being told. That happens more often than people realize. If somebody speaks confidently enough and wraps everything in official-looking paperwork, a lot of people assume it must be legitimate. I stayed quiet and listened. That was important. The more she talked, the more information she gave away. One homeowner eventually raised a hand and asked a simple question. "Does the property owner support this?" The room went silent for a second. Tessa smiled immediately. "We have all necessary authorization pathways under review." Under review. That answer sounded impressive while saying absolutely nothing. I wrote it down. After the meeting, several residents approached me in the parking lot. Most were polite. Some looked embarrassed. One older gentleman named Harold shook his head and said, "Grant, I thought that place belonged to your family." "It does," I answered. He frowned. "Then why is she acting like it does not?" That was a very good question. Around the same time, social media advertisements started appearing online. Friends began sending screenshots. Professional photographs of my lodge were being used to market luxury mountain weddings. Drone footage showed the deck, the great room, the valley view, even the trail leading to the overlook. Every image belonged to my property. Not one advertisement mentioned my name. Not one advertisement mentioned private ownership. Instead, they described the location as a premier Alpine Crest destination experience. That was when I realized innocent people were becoming part of this mess. Brides and grooms were sending deposits. Families were making travel plans. Vendors were scheduling dates months in advance. They were trusting information that was not true. And if everything collapsed later, they would be the ones caught in the middle. That mattered to me. A lot. One evening, I received a phone call from a woman named Diane. She introduced herself as the mother of a bride. Her family lived in Ohio. She sounded excited. "We just wanted to confirm some details before we finalize our deposit," she said. "We are so grateful the community opened this property for events." I sat quietly for a moment. Then I asked where she heard that information. "From Tessa," she replied. "Of course." I thanked her for calling and told her I could not discuss ongoing property issues. That answer disappointed her. It disappointed me too, because by then I knew something she did not. This situation was heading toward a collision. The longer it continued, the bigger the consequences would become. And somewhere behind all the brochures, presentations, promises, and event packages, there was still one question I could not answer. Why was Tessa pushing so hard for access to a property she did not own? I had a feeling the answer was buried in paperwork. I just had to find it. The next Monday, I drove into town before sunrise and headed straight for the San Miguel County Recorder's office. The parking lot was nearly empty. Frost covered the edges of the sidewalks, and the mountains were still hidden behind low clouds rolling through the valley. Most people imagine property disputes being solved in dramatic courtrooms. Most of the time, they start with dusty records and patient research. That morning, I planned to do a lot of both. The clerk behind the counter knew me by name. Small mountain counties are like that. After explaining what I needed, she disappeared into the records area and returned with several files that looked completely ordinary. Ordinary documents can change everything. I spent the next 3 hours reading deed records, parcel maps, trust filings, easement agreements, and development paperwork connected to Alpine Crest. Page by page, the story became clearer. Page by page, Tessa's version became harder to believe. Then I found something interesting. About 7 years earlier, while Alpine Crest was still under construction, the developer had signed a temporary winter emergency access agreement. The agreement allowed limited use of a small overflow parking area near the lower edge of my property during severe snowstorms while public roads were being completed. That was it. No venue rights. No event rights. No commercial use rights. No access to the lodge itself. The agreement had expired 6 years ago. Expired. I requested certified copies immediately. The clerk stamped every page. Then she handed me another file. "You may want to look at this too," she said. That file contained the original HOA declarations. I read every page carefully. The lodge was not listed as a community asset. It was not listed as a shared facility. It was not listed as an amenity. In fact, it was not listed anywhere except as a neighboring private property outside HOA control. Exactly what I expected. Still, seeing it in writing mattered. Documentation beats assumptions every time. On my way out, I called an old friend named Warren Blake. Warren had spent nearly 30 years working commercial property insurance before retiring to Colorado. He understood risk better than anyone I knew. We met for coffee that afternoon. I showed him the event advertisements and explained what was happening. He listened quietly, then leaned back in his chair. "Grant, has anyone talked to you about liability?" I shook my head. Warren frowned. "That should worry you." He explained that if someone hosted large commercial events on private property without proper authorization, insurance questions could become complicated very quickly. If a guest slipped on ice, if equipment damaged the building, or if an emergency occurred, lawyers would start asking questions about ownership and permission. Real questions. Expensive questions. My stomach tightened. This was bigger than a disagreement with a pushy HOA organizer. People were exposing my property to legal risks without my consent. That changed everything. Before driving home, I made one more stop. The security company that monitored the lodge handled digital access records for the gate and several entry points. I requested a complete activity log covering the previous 6 months. The manager printed everything. Most entries looked normal. Service visits, maintenance checks, deliveries. Then a pattern appeared. Multiple access attempts had been made using an old property manager code that should have been disabled years earlier. Several of those attempts matched dates when vendors reported visiting the property. Somebody had been trying to enter using outdated credentials. Somebody knew exactly what they were doing. That evening, I spread every document across the dining table inside the lodge. Deeds, maps, HOA records, insurance notes, security logs, certified copies. The stack kept growing. Outside, snow drifted quietly against the windows while the fireplace crackled in the background. For the first time in weeks, pieces started fitting together. But one question still bothered me. If the documents were this clear, why was Tessa acting so confident? Most people bluff until they see evidence. She was doing the opposite. She was becoming more aggressive, more public, more certain. That usually means one of two things. Either someone knows they are right, or they are desperately hoping nobody looks closely enough to discover they are wrong. I had a feeling I was getting very close to finding out which one it was. 2 days after I gathered the county records, I finally found the piece that explained why Tessa had been acting so confident. It happened completely by accident. A local photographer named Melissa stopped by the lodge one afternoon to return a lens cap she thought belonged to one of her assistants. We ended up talking on the deck while clouds rolled over the mountains and fresh snow dusted the higher peaks. During the conversation, she casually mentioned that she had recently lost a wedding contract. That got my attention. Lost it to who? I asked. Melissa shrugged. Some new company. Marigold Mountain Events. The name hit me immediately. Marigold. As in Tessa Marigold Klein. Suddenly a lot of things started making sense. That evening I searched Colorado business records online. The database was public. Anyone could access it. 10 minutes later I found exactly what I was looking for. Marigold Mountain Events LLC had been registered less than a year earlier. The registered manager was Tessa. The business address matched a private mailbox she used in town. And according to the filings, the company specialized in destination weddings and luxury mountain events. There it was. Not hidden, not complicated, just sitting in plain sight. The more I looked, the stranger things became. Several online advertisements that claimed to represent Alpine Crest were actually linked back to Marigold Mountain Events. Wedding inquiry forms routed directly to the business. Deposit requests routed directly to the business. Even the contact number listed on promotional materials belonged to the business. Not the HOA. The business. That mattered. Very much. The next breakthrough arrived 3 days later. A nervous man named Russell contacted me after hearing rumors that I was questioning event operations. Russell worked as a vendor coordinator for several wedding planners throughout western Colorado. He asked if we could meet privately. We met at a diner outside town. Russell looked uncomfortable before he even sat down. He slid a folder across the table. "I think you should see this," he said. Inside were copies of event invoices. Multiple invoices. Different clients. Different dates. Same pattern. Every document included a line item labeled Alpine Crest Lodge Access Fee. I stared at the paperwork. The problem was obvious. There was no such thing as an Alpine Crest Lodge. It did not exist. My lodge was not owned by Alpine Crest. Never had been. Yet families were paying thousands of dollars under the impression that access had already been secured. Russell lowered his voice. A few vendors started asking questions. Nobody could explain where the authorization actually came from. That was not the only surprise. Buried inside the folder was a copy of an event approval form. At first glance it looked official. HOA logo. Signatures. Formal language. Then I noticed something odd. The board treasurer's signature looked familiar. Too familiar. Earlier that week, I had reviewed HOA meeting minutes at the county office. The signature on those documents was identical. Not similar. Identical. Every curve. Every mark. Every angle. Like a photocopy. My stomach dropped. Somebody had not signed those forms. Somebody had reused a signature image. That changed the entire situation. By this point I could have gone public. I could have posted documents online. I could have started a public argument. I could have marched into the next HOA meeting and confronted Tessa in front of everyone. That would have felt satisfying. It also would have been a mistake. My years in ski patrol taught me something important. When people are making bad decisions, rushing rarely improves the outcome. Patience matters. Evidence matters. Timing matters. So instead of creating a scene, I started building a file. Every advertisement, every invoice, every email, every access log, every county document, everything went into organized folders. Then I contacted an attorney who specialized in property law. She reviewed the evidence carefully. When she finished, she looked up and asked one question. "Do you know when the next event is scheduled?" I nodded. "A large wedding in December." She smiled slightly. "Good." I frowned. "Good. Very good," she replied. "Because now we know exactly where everyone involved is going to be." That was the moment I stopped thinking about whether Tessa was wrong. The documents had already answered that question. The real issue now was how to stop the damage without hurting innocent people who had trusted the wrong person. Somewhere out there, a bride was planning her wedding. Families were booking flights. Vendors were preparing equipment. None of them knew what I knew. None of them knew the paperwork underneath the entire operation was beginning to collapse. And unless I handled this carefully, they would be the ones paying the biggest price. The morning of the wedding arrived with fresh snow on the ridge and a sky so clear it looked painted. Long before the first guest showed up, I was already awake sitting beside the stone fireplace with a cup of coffee and a folder full of documents spread across the table. Outside, workers were hanging lights along the deck railing. Inside, Caterers were arranging tables beneath beams my father installed almost 40 years earlier. Everyone acted like the day belonged to them. It did not. By noon, luxury SUVs filled the driveway. Guests stepped carefully through the snow carrying gifts and garment bags. Laughter echoed across the property. The bride's family had flown in from Ohio. The groom's relatives came from Texas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. They looked excited. They looked happy. They had no idea they were walking into the middle of a property dispute. That was not their fault. Around 1 o'clock, I noticed Tessa moving through the crowd like a celebrity greeting supporters. Vendors stopped to speak with her. Guests thanked her for organizing everything. Even some Alpine Crest residents treated her like the owner of the entire mountain. Confidence is powerful, sometimes too powerful. At 1:30, my attorney arrived. She parked quietly near the lower lot and walked inside carrying a slim leather case. A few minutes later, a representative from the county fire marshal's office arrived. Then another vehicle appeared. Then another. None of them caused a scene. None of them interrupted anything. They simply waited. Timing matters. By 2 o'clock, every chair was occupied. The musicians began playing. The groom stood near the front, smiling nervously while guests turned toward the staircase. Then I walked through the main entrance. Several people recognized me immediately. Others remembered seeing me in photographs around the property. A few guests looked confused. Tessa looked annoyed. "Grant," she said while forcing a smile, "this is neither the time nor the place." I looked around the room. "Actually, I think it is exactly the time." Her expression hardened. "This event is authorized." "That is what we are about to discuss," I replied. She stepped forward and lowered her voice. "You are embarrassing yourself." I almost felt sorry for her at that moment. Almost. Before I could answer, 2 sheriff's deputies entered through the rear doors. Conversation stopped. The musicians lowered their instruments. Guests turned in their seats. Tessa immediately relaxed. That was the interesting part. She thought they were there for me. "Deputies," she said confidently. "Thank you for coming." One of them nodded politely. "Ma'am." That was all he said. Then he walked past her. Straight past her. He approached the front of the room where my attorney was already waiting. The silence became noticeable. My attorney opened her case and handed several certified documents to the deputy. The deputy reviewed them carefully. Then he looked toward the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "we need to address a property authorization issue before this event can continue." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Tessa took a step forward. "There is no issue," she said. "The HOA has venue access authority." The deputy turned toward her. "Can you provide documentation supporting that claim?" "Of course," she replied immediately. She handed over the same authorization form I had seen weeks earlier. The deputy examined it. Then he handed it to my attorney. My attorney placed a second document beside it. Then a third. Then a fourth. Certified deed. County parcel map. HOA declarations. Expired access agreement. One by one. Piece by piece. The room watched in complete silence. "This property is privately owned by Grant Hollis Vane through a recorded family trust," my attorney explained. "The lodge is not an HOA amenity. It is not community property. It is not available for commercial event use without written owner authorization." Every word landed like a brick. Tessa's confidence finally began to crack. "That is not correct," she said. But her voice sounded different now. Smaller. The deputy lifted the expired access agreement. "This document allowed temporary emergency parking access years ago," he said. "It does not authorize weddings, events, venue rentals, or commercial operations." Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody smiled anymore. Then came the moment that changed everything. My attorney placed the event authorization form beside copies of HOA records. "The board treasurer has already confirmed this approval was never authorized by the board," she said. "And the signature appearing here was not executed for this document." The room froze. Completely. Guests looked at Tessa. Vendors looked at Tessa. Even several Alpine Crest residents looked at Tessa. For the first time since I had known her, she had no speech prepared. No presentation. No slogan. No clever phrase about community benefits. Just silence. And standing there in the middle of the room, surrounded by flowers, decorations, and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of planning built on assumptions, she finally realized something I had known for weeks. The paperwork was real. The ownership records were real. The authority she had been claiming never existed. For several seconds after the truth came out, Nobody moved. The musicians stood quietly beside their instruments. The wedding planner stared at the paperwork spread across the table. Guests exchanged confused looks while trying to understand what had just happened. Reality had finally caught up with the story they had been told. Then things started changing very quickly. The deputies remained calm. The fire marshal remained professional. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody created a scene. That mattered because most of the people inside that room were not responsible for any of this. They were families, friends, vendors, and guests who had trusted the wrong person. The deputy addressed the crowd first. Ladies and gentlemen, we are asking everyone to exit the building in an orderly manner while property authorization issues are resolved. There was disappointment. There was frustration. There were a few tears from relatives who had traveled a long distance. But there was also understanding. Once people saw the documents, most realized what had happened. One by one, guests began gathering coats and personal belongings. The bride's father approached me while workers quietly started removing decorations. He looked exhausted. "You really own this place?" he asked. I nodded. "I do." He looked down for a moment and sighed. "I wish somebody had told us sooner." I understood exactly what he meant. "I wish somebody had told you the truth sooner too," I replied. A few hours later, the parking lot was empty. Snow had started falling again. The lodge was quiet for the first time all day, but the story was far from over. During the following weeks, investigators reviewed business records, event contracts, HOA communications, and financial documents connected to the operation. Questions multiplied quickly. Where had deposits gone? Who approved the marketing materials? Who authorized use of the property? Photographs. Why were customers being told access rights existed when official records said otherwise? Those questions deserved answers. They got them. The HOA board ordered an independent audit. Several board members publicly stated they had never approved commercial use of private property. The board treasurer formally confirmed that the signature appearing on event authorization documents had not been provided for those agreements. More facts surfaced. Then more. The picture became clearer with every review. Eventually, Marigold Mountain Events stopped advertising entirely. Future bookings were canceled. Clients received notices explaining that venue access claims could not be supported. Families who had paid deposits were directed toward reimbursement procedures and settlement negotiations. Most importantly, they finally knew the truth. Truth matters. Back at Alpine Crest, something interesting happened. Residents started asking harder questions. They wanted to know how assumptions had become policy. They wanted to know why nobody verified ownership records before promoting community access. They wanted transparency. That was probably the healthiest outcome of the entire situation. Communities function best when facts matter more than personalities. Several months later, the HOA adopted new procedures requiring written verification before any property could be presented as a community asset, event space, or shared amenity. Simple rule. Powerful rule. As for the lodge, life gradually returned to normal. The decorations disappeared. The rental equipment disappeared. The noise disappeared. I replaced access codes, updated security protocols, and installed a new sign near the driveway entrance. The sign was simple. Private property. Access by written permission only. No confusion. One cold winter morning, I stood on the deck watching sunlight hit the snow-covered peaks beyond the valley. The mountains looked exactly the way they had looked when my parents first built the lodge decades earlier. The fireplace crackled behind me. Fresh coffee steamed in my hand. Everything felt quiet again. And standing there, I thought about something my father used to say whenever neighbors argued about fences, roads, or property lines. Good people solve problems with facts before they solve them with opinions. He was right. Looking back, the biggest lesson was never about winning. It was about staying calm long enough to let the truth do its job. Property rights matter. Documentation matters. Patience matters. Loud people often look powerful for a while. But paperwork has a funny way of making loud people very quiet.